Friends, this is a channel about real life. No sugarcoating, no lies, only men's stories full of struggle, betrayal, and loss. It's about those who life knocked down, but who still found the strength to rise and keep going. If you seek honesty, strength, and inspiration, you're in the right place.
The mountains were silent that morning. Wrapped in a veil of white snow fell slowly, layer after layer, turning the world into something both beautiful and cruel. The wind was sharp, like knives slicing across skin, and the air was so thin that every breath felt stolen rather than earned for most. This place was a prison, a cage of ice, but for him, the man who carried both sorrow and fire in his chest, the mountains had become something more, a stage where his fate would be decided. His name was Ethan, though few now called him that. In his village, in the valley far below, they whispered other names: traitor, liar, coward, words that were heavier than any snowstorm, words that cut deeper than frost. He had once been celebrated, once carried the respect of men and the admiration of women. His family had believed in him, his friends had followed him, but that was before the day of betrayal. It had not been his crime. That truth was the fire that burned in his soul. He had been accused of something he did not do, of abandoning his men in the mountains, of leaving them to die when the storm struck. The bodies had never been found. Only whispers carried down with the avalanche. He alone survived that survival. Instead of proof of strength, became a curse. He must have run, he must have chosen himself over them, they said, and once the rumor had spread, nothing could erase it. The memory haunted him like the icy wind. He could still hear the screams of his companions swallowed by the storm, still see the desperate flashes of their torches before the snow buried them forever. He had fought, he had shouted, he had dug until his hands bled, but the mountain was stronger. And yet when he returned alone, battered and half dead, no one saw his fight. They saw only the emptiness behind him, and in that emptiness, they painted him guilty. Now Ethan walked alone, far from the valley, deeper into the wild ranges where no man dared build his home. Each step crunched against the endless ice. Each night, he built a fire with trembling hands. Watching the sparks rise against the black sky, he lived in exile, not by chains or bars, but by shame and injustice. But exile does not break every man some reforges. In those long nights, Ethan thought not only of the betrayal, but of what it meant. He thought of the life he had lost, his wife's warm smile, his son's laughter, the feeling of being trusted, all of it gone, not by his mistake, but by the weight of false judgment. He could let it kill him, or he could climb higher, walk deeper, and find a truth that no lie could bury. The mountains had taken his friends, but they also hid his answers somewhere beyond these ridges. There were places even the villagers did not know, ruins of old travelers, forgotten paths, maybe even the remains of the men he was accused of abandoning. Ethan felt it like a pull in his chest. If he could find proof, if he could uncover the truth hidden beneath the snow, he could return not as a beggar, but as a man reborn. Days turned to weeks, his body hardened, his beard grew long, and the frost no longer pierced him as it once had hunger gnawed at him. But he learned to snare what little life moved in that frozen wasteland. Thirst nearly killed him, but he found ways to melt snow, to catch the water dripping from icicles. Slowly, painfully, he was becoming something else. Not the villager they spat upon, not the leader they had once praised, but a survivor. And then, one night, beneath a sky torn with northern lights, he saw it far away, half buried in the snow. A shadow of wood and stone. It was not natural, it was not a tree, not a rock, it was something built by men. Long ago, his heart pounded as he trudged closer, his legs heavy as lead. When he reached it, he realized it was the remnants of a cabin, its roof caved in, its walls blackened with the scars of fire. Inside, among the ruins, he found bones, not fresh, not his companions, but ancient travelers who had died long before him. On the wall, faintly preserved under ice, were carvings, strange symbols, like maps of mountains no villager had ever drawn. He traced them with numb fingers, and though he could not yet understand, he knew this. He was not the first to be tested by these peaks, and he would not be the last. That night, as the aurora danced. Ethan swore to himself that he would uncover the truth of both the mountain and his past. He would not die a traitor. He would rise as a man who faced the storm and proved himself stronger. The wind howled outside the ruined cabin, but Ethan no longer feared it for the first time in months. He felt not like a man running from shame, but a man chasing destiny. The next morning, the storm had eased, but the mountains still seemed alive with whispers that only Ethan could hear. Every ridge held a secret, every shadow seemed to watch him, as if the world itself were judging his steps. He packed what little food remained in his bag, slung over one shoulder, and began to climb higher, following the faint trail of footprints in the snow. He did not know whose they were, or whether they had been made yesterday or decades ago, but instinct told him that they were connected to what he had been searching for since the moment the mountains had claimed his friends. Hours passed, and the sun rose pale and weak over the peaks, turning the snow into a blinding white. See, Ethan's eyes burned from the reflection, and yet he could not stop. The wind whipped his face and drove ice into his bones. Yet he welcomed it, for it reminded him that he was alive, that he could still feel, and that survival required not just strength but endurance. He thought of Sarah and the children he had once held close before the storm and betrayal had severed those bonds. They were memories, now flickers of warmth in a frozen world. But even memories had power. They pushed him forward into the unknown. By midday, he stumbled upon an old trail hidden beneath a ridge. The snow had almost erased it completely, but the faint marks of human passage were still visible. He followed the trail and found an abandoned cabin half buried in ice. The door hung crooked from its hinges, and the windows were darked over with frost. Yet from somewhere within it seemed to exude a warmth, a flicker of something alive. He hesitated, the lessons of caution drilled into him from years in the wild, warning him not to enter yet. Something deeper than fear pulled him forward, the voice of destiny. He told himself, the voice of what had been denied to him. Inside the cabin, it was darker than he expected, yet the smell of charred wood and old smoke clung to the air. As he stepped across the threshold, his boots left faint prints in the dust. He ran his hand over the walls and discovered old etchings, lines, and symbols that told stories, long forgotten travelers lost to the mountain, legends of creatures that prowled beneath the snow, the whispers of men who had disappeared without a trace. Each symbol seemed to vibrate with a hidden energy. Ethan felt it pressing into his mind, making his head swim and his heart race. He sat down on the broken floorboards, trying to catch his breath, yet sleep refused him, even as exhaustion threatened to take him. Hours became days inside the cabin. He survived on what he could salvage from broken crates and melting snow. He explored every corner, finding old journals, maps, and fragments of lives left behind. He pieced together stories of other men who had come seeking fortune, glory, or refuge, only to vanish into the same storm that had claimed his friends. These men had left warnings carved into walls and scribbled in books. Ethan read each word, absorbing the fear and determination of those who had tried before him. He began to understand that the mountains were testing more than body. They tested mind, courage, and conviction. He began marking his own notes on the walls, making plans for the path ahead, understanding that he could not simply survive. He had to confront the truths buried beneath the ice. On the fourth day, he heard something that made him freeze. The wind shifted and carried a faint sound, a voice calling from far below the ridges. His heart leapt. Was it Sarah or Mark or Lily? Had they followed him somehow, or were they trapped somewhere unseen? He shouted back, his voice breaking through the hollow cabins and across the frozen hills, but only the echo returned. He pressed on nevertheless, every fiber of his being straining toward the sound through snowdrifts deeper than he could have imagined. He clawed his way forward, slipping and falling, yet rising again. The voice faded and returned in cycles, sometimes near, sometimes impossibly distant. He realized that whatever called him was not bound by ordinary reality, and that to answer it, he must abandon all sense of normalcy. That night, the sky erupted in pale greens, and blue's northern lights dancing like ethereal phantoms across the horizon. The snow around the cabin seemed to glow faintly, reflecting the shifting colors. Ethan watched transfixed and felt a strange calm settle over him. Despite the terror, exhaustion, and the constant threat of the storm, he felt something he had not felt in months, a sense of purpose, a clarity that came from understanding that his path was his own alone. He did not know what awaited him tomorrow, but he knew that whatever lay ahead, it would not break him as the lies of men had tried to do. He was not a traitor. He was not weak. He was a survivor, and every step through snow and shadow affirmed that truth. The storm had returned with a fury unlike anything Ethan had faced before. Snow whipped across the ridges in sharp waves, obscuring every landmark and turning familiar paths into a maze of white. He had learned to read the mountains, to understand their moods, but this was something else, something alive that shifted and twisted the snow around him, hiding dangers that lurked beneath the surface. The cold burned into his lungs, and he felt the sting of frostbite creeping into his fingers, yet he pressed on, driven by a force he did not fully understand. Through the night, he stumbled upon a narrow ravine. The wind howled through it like the cries of lost souls, and the snow formed shapes that seemed almost deliberate. He thought he saw shadows moving against the walls of ice and rock, and for a moment he feared he had lost his mind. Yet every instinct told him that what he saw was real, that something in the mountains was aware of him, watching, testing his resolve. He climbed the jagged edges, slowly, carefully, using every ounce of strength to stay upright. He felt exhaustion like a weight pressing on his chest, yet he could not stop, not when he was so close to answers that might restore his life and clear his name. When he reached the top of the ravine, he saw it through the swirling snow, a structure half buried in ice and frost, an old observatory built generations ago to study the peaks and the stars. Its roof was caved in and windows shattered, but from within came a faint light, flickering almost as if alive. Ethan approached cautiously, his boots sinking into deep snow. He heard a faint whispering voice calling his name, or perhaps it was the wind mimicking the sound. He paused and considered turning back, but something in his heart refused. He had survived too much, endured too many injustices to turn away now. Inside the observatory, it was warmer than the outside. Though still bitterly cold, a fire had long gone out, but embers remained glowing faintly. He explored the circular room, examining charts, telescopes, and broken furniture. Discovered symbols etched into the walls, ancient writing. He could not decipher at first, but as he traced the lines with his fingers, they began to form images of men and women walking the peaks of the mountains, facing storms, wolves, avalanches, and strange creatures that seemed to shift shape in the snow. He realized that this place had been a refuge and a prison for generations, that those who came seeking answers often disappeared, leaving only their marks on the walls. That night, the wind roared like a living thing. The northern lights danced wildly across the sky, and Ethan huddled in a corner, studying the maps and journals. He read of travelers who had vanished and of strange occurrences no ordinary man could explain. He felt the presence of something watching him, guiding him, testing his courage and patience. He realized that the mountains were alive, not just in snow and stone, but in memory and fear in the stories passed down through generations. Each step he had taken had led him here, to this nexus of mystery and revelation. Over the following days, he navigated treacherous paths, guided by the symbols and whispers. He encountered creatures of frost that moved at the edges of vision, shadows that mimicked his movements, and voices that echoed through ravines calling his name. He survived on frozen streams, and what little food he could carry. He learned the rhythm of snowstorms, the patterns of wind, and the hidden dangers lurking beneath what appeared calm and still. Each challenge strengthened him, his body hardened, his mind sharpened, and a quiet resolve grew in his chest. He was no longer the man accused of betrayal. He was a force shaped by snow, wind, and injustice. On the seventh day, he discovered a hidden chamber beneath the observatory, carved into the rock. Its entrance was narrow, and the air within smelled of ice and stone. He crawled inside, and found relics of those who had come before, old journals, fragmented maps, and symbols etched in blood and ink. He read their words carefully, each telling of trials faced in the mountains and the test of character required to survive. Some had failed, some had succeeded. But all had been changed forever. Ethan realized that his journey was not just to survive the storm or prove his innocence, but to confront the essence of courage and fear itself, to emerge not broken, but tempered by the mountain. As night fell on the seventh day, the storm outside intensified. Lightning flashed across the peaks, illuminating the observatory in harsh white light. Ethan stepped outside, feeling the wind tearing at his clothes and biting into his skin, yet he smiled because he understood finally that the mountain did not judge him as guilty or innocent. It only tested the heart and spirit of those who dared enter its domain. He felt the injustice of the village, fading like distant echoes replaced by the understanding that truth and survival often lie not in the eyes of others, but in the strength of one's own will. Ethan knew that what lay ahead could not be faced half-heartedly. The mountains had tested him for weeks, and now he felt the weight of all his choices pressing on him. Each ridge seemed taller, each snowdrift deeper, and every shadow heavier than before. Yet he stepped forward because he understood the storm was not merely outside. It was inside him. The fear, guilt, and anger he had carried all his life were no longer his chains. They were his tools. He had learned to harness them to move faster, climb higher, endure longer. The observatory had revealed its secrets, but the mountains held more. Their peaks twisted impossibly in the distance like frozen waves, and the wind carried voices not always human, warning or guiding him. He could not tell, yet he trusted his instincts. Every step was deliberate and cautious. He slid across ice cliffs, clung to sheer walls of snow, and navigated frozen ravines that seemed endless. Each night, he lit small fires in caves or behind ridges, using the smoke to keep track of his path and to ward off what he could not see. The stars above were his map, and the northern lights his signal that he was moving in the right direction. On the 10th day, he came to a ridge overlooking a valley shrouded in thick mist and snow. He could see a structure barely distinguishable through the storm. Its towers leaned as if weighed down by the cold and frost, yet inside light flickered dimly, as if someone or something awaited him. Ethan's heart pounded in both fear and anticipation. He had no idea what he would find, but he understood that this was the place the mountains had been guiding him toward. Every step he had taken since the storm began, he clenched his fists and began the final descent. The path was treacherous. Jagged rocks protruded from snowbanks, and avalanches threatened at every turn. He moved cautiously, yet with purpose. He remembered the lies that had branded him a traitor, the village that had turned its back, and the family he had loved, but could not protect. His anger and sorrow fueled each movement, giving him strength beyond normal endurance. He was no longer simply surviving. He was confronting the forces that had sought to break him. When he arrived at the base of the valley, he saw them, the shadows of figures moving between the broken walls of an ancient fortress half buried in snow. They were taller than men, their shapes flickering and unnatural, and yet he sensed a humanity twisted by time and ice. As he approached the gates, he heard whispers calling his name, beckoning him inside. He hesitated only a moment before stepping into the light of the flickering torches, and the shadows within shifted closer. Inside the fortress, Ethan felt a presence that pressed against his mind like the storm pressed against his body. The air was thick with anticipation, and something unearthly watched him from the corners. He moved forward, guided by instinct and memory of the voices that had haunted him since the disappearance of his companions. His steps echoed against stone walls and through corridors littered with relics of travelers lost and forgotten. The shadows shifted and whispered secrets that only he could hear, testing his courage and the truth of his own heart. Hours passed like days as Ethan navigated the fortress, its hidden chambers and icy halls. He encountered trials designed to measure his resolve. His fear confronted him as illusions of his family lost, his friends frozen and screaming in the cold. Each challenge pushed him to his limits, and beyond. Yet he endured. The mountain had not abandoned him. It had refined him, teaching him that survival required both body and mind, and that injustice could be countered only by understanding and courage. By the end of the night, he reached the highest tower, the one that seemed to pierce the sky from the outside. Its windows were broken, but inside he found a room untouched by snow or storm relics from the past, where carefully placed a journal lay open and a single candle flickered. He read and understood the history of those who had come before him, all accused of failure, all tested by the mountains, and all transformed. If they survived, Ethan had endured the storm, the snow, and the shadows, and now he was ready. Ethan sat in the highest chamber of the fortress, watching the northern lights twist across the sky. The cold outside was absolute, but here he felt a strange warmth, a calm that came from understanding. He traced the ancient journal with trembling fingers, reading stories of those who had survived the trials and those who had failed. Some had perished, succumbing to fear. Others had been lost to the illusions the mountains conjured. Yet all had left a mark on the world, waiting for someone to continue their legacy. He realized that his journey had not been simply about clearing his name, but about becoming the kind of man who could endure the impossible. The shadows that had haunted him since entering the valley now seemed less threatening. They moved with purpose, guiding him to a hidden alcove where a single relic lay. It was a crystal encased in ice, faintly glowing and humming with energy. He understood instinctively that this was the heart of the trials, the focus of the mountain's test. His hand hovered above it, and for a moment he hesitated, remembering the betrayal, the village, the loss, the accusation, the shame. Yet all of it seemed distant now, replaced by clarity and the steady pulse of determination. He grasped the crystal, and a wave of light surged through him. Images of past travelers and their struggles flashed before his eyes. The whispers became a chorus, speaking truths and lies, histories and secrets all intertwined. He felt the injustice he had suffered dissolve, not because the world would recognize him, but because he finally recognized himself. He was not guilty. He was not weak. He had endured and learned and emerged stronger than any storm could destroy. The journey back through the fortress was both familiar and new. The shadows now seemed to salute him, moving aside as he passed through halls and corridors. He felt the wind of the mountains following him, guiding him down the ridges. The snow was still fierce, yet he no longer feared it. Each step was measured, sure, confident. The valley spread before him as dawn broke, pale sunlight reflecting off endless snow and ice. He felt a connection to everything around him: the mountains, the storms, the lost travelers, and the spirit of survival that had always existed here. When Ethan finally descended to the lower slopes, he saw the village in the distance, the familiar shapes of roofs and roads appearing like ghosts through the haze. He wondered how they would react to him if he returned. They had condemned him in his absence, blamed him for what he could not control, dismissed his survival as luck or deceit. Yet he understood something crucial now: the truth did not require their recognition. It existed regardless of their judgment, and he carried it in every scar, every frozen breath, every step across the peaks. Back in his home, he saw Sarah, Mark, and Lily waiting, unsure, fearful, yet hopeful. Ethan embraced them tightly, feeling the warmth of family. His heart swelled, not with vengeance, but with understanding. He had survived the mountains, confronted the lies, endured the storms, and returned stronger, wiser, and unbroken. He had discovered that the world might not always believe or reward justice, but the mountains had taught him that true courage and resilience were measured not by others, but by oneself. As night fell over the village and the first stars appeared, Ethan stood at the edge of the ridge, looking back at the peaks. They were silent, once more, yet alive in his memory. He felt gratitude and reverence, not for revenge or recognition, but for the trials that had forged him into a man beyond fear, beyond shame, and beyond the reach of false judgment. The mountains had given him their ultimate gift: insight and the unshakable knowledge that he had survived the impossible and returned whole. The wind whispered across the snow, carrying the echoes of the lost, the whispers of the mountain. and the pulse of life itself, Ethan closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and for the first time in months felt complete, not because the village believed him, but because he had faced everything alone and emerged victorious. The night was quiet, the stars endless, and the mountains eternal, and Ethan knew that he would carry their lessons with him always.